In previous chapters, we talked about the idea of corporate governance. And corporate governance simply meant that the directors of the company were confident that everybody inside the company was doing what they were supposed to. Now, when I say they're doing what they're supposed to, in effect what I mean is that they're carrying out their jobs properly. They are not doing something which is perhaps too slow. So they're doing their job in a way that is slow, it's costing the shareholders money. If I could do something in an hour, but I spend 5 hours doing it, I in effect get paid for 5 hours worth of work, of which 4 hours aren't really worth anything. So we need to make sure that people are not doing a job in an inefficient way. We also need to make sure that people are not doing a job in an ineffective way. And by ineffective, I mean that they spend 5 hours doing something, and at the end of it, what they've produced isn't actually of any use to anybody. So the whole idea behind Chapter 17 is to look at what's called control. Control is how you get people to do things. Now, there are a number of ways that you could control people. You could stand over and watch them. That's one way of controlling them, but of course that's not really very realistic in most modern day organisations. So in effect what we're going to have is other ways that we can control people. Now when we're talking about control, you can see there it says it's a mechanism to encourage people to behave in a particular way. We have already seen one method of getting people to behave in a particular way, which we saw a few chapters ago, which was motivation. You don't have to tell somebody to work in a particular way. You encourage them to want to work in a particular way. If you do it like this, I give you a bonus. That's an internal control. Now, there are other internal controls you can have, and basically all internal controls fall into a number of different groups. The most common ones, at least as far as the exam is concerned, one control is looking at what happened at the end. So wait for you to do something, wait until the end, and then say that was fine or that was a problem that needs fixing. Now that's the idea behind variances that you look at in paper F2. So the idea is to say, right, you did this, there was an adverse variance, that means you did something wrong, we want to know what you did wrong. People will worry that they're going to have an adverse variance, so they will do things the right way. So you won't, in the end, the idea is you don't have to stand and watch them. They'll be so worried about doing something wrong, getting an adverse variance, that they won't let it go wrong. Now that's a way of controlling them without standing over them. The thing is that that control comes at the end. So we do everything, and if there was a problem, we only find out about it at the end. Now the other kind of control is to try and prevent there from being a problem in the first place. It's sometimes known as a preventative control. And this is doing things like having lots of rules and lots of procedures. You will do it like this. If you follow these rules, then you will have done the job properly. So internal controls do tend to fit into one of those two main groups. Now, F2 we've already talked about. Wait until the end, looking at what you've done and saying, is there a problem? Other kinds of controls, preventative controls, is more F8, P1, P7. So, internal control then. It's basically anything to make sure that the goals and objectives will be achieved. In other words, that we will be efficient and will be effective, as I just mentioned. Turnbull. Turnbull was somebody who basically was in charge of a report that talked about internal controls. And the Turnbull guidelines say the purpose is to make sure that your financial accounts are reliable. We know all the debits and credits are in there, and that all of the managerial stuff we've been doing is reliable. So any management reports are okay. Hopefully, you can see they're effective and efficient. And also compliance, fitting in with any rules and regulations which we have to make sure we do. How do we make sure that people aren't breaking the law? It could be that they don't know what it is. So how do we make sure they don't break any regulations? And the internal control framework, these are the 5 bits that Turnbull says is important. First of all, what's called the control environment. The control environment simply means what is the attitude of senior management. Do they care if there is a risk? Are they even aware that there are various risks out there? If they are aware of them, do they care and do they take any action about them? Now, if you imagine for example that you are working in a bank looking at credit card applications. 2-3 years ago, you would probably have taken a lot of risks. You would say, well, we don't really know what this person will be able to pay back, so let's give them a credit card, let's give them a lot of money. They are aware that there's a risk, but they don't really care. They're more worried about getting somebody signed up to a credit card, so then we can start charging them interest, than they are worried about will the person pay it back. Now, in 2008, the opposite is true. Now they are aware of the risks, their attitude has changed completely. If in doubt, you don't get a credit card, or if you do, your credit limit is very, very low. So the control environment is a very important thing. What do we think about all the risks that our business is facing? Do we care, or are we going to be very, very careful and make sure we don't take any risks at all? Risk assessment. How do we work out what the risks actually are and how serious they are? What do we then decide to do about them? Now, a few years ago, there was a very good article by a CIMA examiner about this, because this appears in the CIMA syllabus as well. And they were talking about what happens when you cross the road. Every time you cross the road, you go through this entire process. One way to make sure that there is going to be as little problem as possible is you go to a set of traffic lights and you wait for the traffic lights to turn so that the cars are not supposed to travel, and then you cross the road. That's basically being very, very cautious. Now, there are times when you and I don't bother about that at all. When you run across the road, even though you shouldn't do. So, risk awareness, how do you work out what the danger is? You look at the traffic, you judge how fast it's going, you look at how far away it is, and in your mind you make a calculation. It's safe for me to cross if I walk, it's safe for me to cross if I run, it's not safe at all. And you're going through all these things in your mind. Now, that's exactly the same as companies do. They have to think, how do we work out if it's safe or not? And then how do we work out, is it safe if we run, or is it not safe at all? So, risk awareness. How are we going to find out? The information system you use if you are crossing the road is you're probably going to be your ears to hear the sound of the traffic, your eyes to judge how far away, and your experience. Information systems, what information do we need from the outside world? Do we need to find out information about the economy or our rivals or what's going on politically? What do we need to know so we can work out is it safe or not? Fourth one. How are we going to monitor it? Now again, I suspect if you are crossing the road and you have realised that you've got time to walk across, even then you probably don't look at the traffic, say it's safe, and then just face ahead. You probably keep looking at the traffic, you keep checking, am I still going to be okay? Do I need to speed up because that car's a bit faster than I thought it was? So you don't just simply walk across and never look at the traffic again, you keep checking. How are we going to do that? How are we going to keep checking? How are we going to know? And finally, when it talks about monitoring the controls, it's talking about updating them. Now, imagine, for example, that you were thinking about crossing the road on your own. Fair enough. You know how long it's going to take you. What about if you were with a nephew or a niece or a child, yours or somebody else's? You wouldn't act in the same way. You'd be much more cautious because the child can't cross the road as quickly as you, and there's obviously going to be more consequences if there's a problem. So you would monitor the controls and be thinking, do I need to perhaps act in a different way now? Probably you'd go to a crossing and do it properly. So all of these things are things that accountants get involved with. These are all common areas that people working in finance deal with. They're going to lead on to F8, P1 and P7, which is why they are here. Now, we don't want to make it too complicated. You may think it's complicated enough already, but we don't want to make it too complicated. So we simply have to know what's going on. What do we have to think about with controls? Underneath that, what types of controls are there? Now, again, this is just a list. I would suspect in the exam you'll be given a scenario and it will say, what kind of control do we have? Administrative controls, filling out bits of paper before you are allowed to do something. So an example of an administrative control would be something like, you're not allowed to buy something for the company until somebody has authorised it. You have to get the bit of paper signed. That's a control to stop people just buying whatever they want to. Preventative controls are ones that stop you doing something. Detective controls are ones that find out it's gone wrong. Preventative controls, rules and regulations. Detective controls, variances. One goes at the start, one goes at the end. Discretionary controls, non-discretionary controls. Discretionary controls, you don't have to follow it. Non-discretionary, you have no choice, you do have to follow it. So discretionary controls would be guidelines. You don't have to do it like this, but we would advise you to do it. That was like corporate governance. If you remember corporate governance, you don't have to do it, but it's a good idea to. Again, voluntary and mandated controls. A mandated control might be something that the government says you must do. A voluntary control is one that you choose to do. You get a lot of those in things like health and safety. You must do it like this, otherwise you're breaking the law. You can do more than that to make it even safer. Manual and automated. If you are typing things into a computer, does the computer check that you're typing them in correctly? The example that I often give is things like ACCA exam results. So what happens is an ACCA script gets marked by a marker. This is going to be paper F4 onwards. And it gets entered in the computer. How do you know it's been entered correctly? One check would be manually. I look at what the number is on the script. I look at what it says in the computer. I check they are the same. An automated control, I enter the number in a computer, give the script to the person next to me. They enter the number into the computer. If the numbers aren't the same, I've put in 54 and my colleague's put in 45. If the numbers aren't the same, the computer says one of you's wrong. It won't let the other person, it won't enter it. So that's an automated control. Yep, so manual, it's up to me. Automated, it's the computer that's going to do it. General and application. General controls are the ones that we saw a little bit earlier when we talked about things like making sure the computer isn't too hot, too cold, that you don't spill coffee on it, otherwise it will stop working. They're things to make sure the computer carries on working, in other words. Application controls are over particular programs. You put some numbers in and the computer says, did you mean to do that? You put some other numbers in, did you mean to do that? So general controls are over the PC, like having a password before you can access it, which a lot of you will have. An application control is when you're doing a spreadsheet, you put in a formula and the computer says that's wrong. Are you sure that's what you meant to do? And finally on this page, we have got financial and non-financial. So again, financial controls are to do with money, non-financial controls are to do with everything else. Why is it important? We've already said it improves efficiency and effectiveness. You do a better job for less money, therefore happy customers and more profits. So internal controls are sensible. It's good corporate governance. We've mentioned that. In some countries, you have to do things in certain ways. So you've got to comply with the law. Fraud is something we'll see in the final chapter. But the more controls you've got, the less likely fraud is to occur. And finally, the auditors. Now, again, we're not that worried about auditing in this paper. We'll mention it a little bit later on in this chapter. But the idea is that the better your controls are, the more the auditors will appreciate that you've done a good job. Your numbers are more likely to be accurate. It saves them from doing lots of work. So they don't have to go through and check everything because they know that any mistakes you will already have found. Talk about that a little bit later on. So, next bit we get to is auditing itself. So auditing, there are two kinds, internal, external. Any of you that work in a company are probably used to the idea of an external audit. An external audit, somebody from outside comes along and checks the financial records to see if they look about right. They do that on behalf of the shareholders. Remember, we've said in earlier chapters, it's the shareholders that own the company, but it's the directors that run it. So in effect, it's the shareholders knowing that what we're doing is the right thing. Internal auditing is different. Internal auditing is looking at how effective we are. It might also be looking at how efficient we are. So it's making sure we're doing the right things and we're not spending more money than we need to. Now, you can upset all your customers and you can throw loads of money away and your external audit will still be okay. Yes, the financial records are okay. It's just they're not as good as they could be. So internal audit is not to do with, are the financial statements correct? It's nothing to do with, have you followed International Accounting Standard 17? It's simply, are you wasting money buying things that you don't need? Are you wasting money because you're buying them from expensive suppliers when you don't need to? That's what the sort of thing internal audit would look at. So internal auditors try and improve things. They try and improve the way that we do things. Before you order anything, see if you actually need it, and then check 3 or 4 suppliers, see who's cheapest. Now, that's an internal control, but it's not going to have any difference. The debit and credit is still going to be the same thing. What it's trying to do this time is it's simply trying to say, can we do things efficiently? Internal audit is all to do with risk management. Again, there is a risk we spend too much money. Internal audit can reduce that. There is a risk we upset our customers. Internal audit can reduce that. So again, we don't need to get bogged down with all the different stuff that internal and external auditors do, but there are a number of things that internal audit can do in order to help. Internal audit, however, it's not a brilliant solution. It's a good solution, but it doesn't mean we won't have any problems. One issue, as far as internal audit is concerned, is the trouble is that they are commenting and they are criticising people that they work with. External auditors are a completely different company. If they want to come along and say, you're doing it wrong, well, that's up to them. But an internal auditor has to work with the people that they might be criticising, so it's a little bit more tricky. They may not be independent. So they might say, you're doing it wrong, and somebody says, yes, but don't tell anybody. So independence. It also might be difficult for them to get enough resources, particularly enough staff. Internal audit is often not something that's treated particularly seriously in companies. There's other things to do. A bit like management accounting. A company needs to do its financial accounting, so they'll take that first and take it most seriously. Management accounting, companies don't have to do, although it would be very foolish for them not to. But they don't have to do it, so it may not be a priority. Same with internal audit, may not be a priority. So, internal auditing is basically about us trying to do a better job inside the company. External auditing is we're looking at the accounting records to make sure that they are relatively accurate and they comply with legislation and accounting standards. Now you can see external auditing is another control measure. Even if we haven't picked something up, there is a problem in our financial records, the auditors will hopefully notice it. It is not their job to try and find everything. Yeah, one of the things that people get wrong is they think that auditors are supposed to find every single mistake. They're not. They're supposed to find any major mistakes. But if there is a mistake, it's one more check, so they're more likely to pick it up. What's the big differences between internal and external audits then? Well, I hope by now it's fairly obvious. Internal is inside the organisation. So they are employees, they work for the company. It's good corporate governance, but you don't have to do it. So it's like ethics. Ethically, it's a good idea, but you don't have to do it. So you should do it, but you don't have to. The scope, what is it that they're going to do? Often, it's to do with efficiency, financial, and effectiveness, operational, trying to make us better. Whereas on the other hand, external audit is a different company, and you have to have an audit for various organisations. Anything listed on a stock exchange, any large company must have an audit. Internal audit is optional. And the final thing there is they are there to report to the shareholders. So they're there to make sure that the accounts are relatively accurate. Now, the way that they will do that is through doing various kinds of tests. So the kind of tests that they might do, we might have things such as substantive tests and compliance tests. Now, internal auditors are very much concerned with compliance tests. What that means is checking controls. How do we make sure that we're not ordering inventory unless we absolutely need to? So a compliance test would be to say, well, what do you do before you order any inventory? That maybe you don't do anything, maybe you just think you need something. Or is there some tests that you're supposed to do? You're supposed to go and count how many items are left. We will want some proof that you actually did that. So a compliance test is saying, you were supposed to do this before you ordered some more inventory. Prove that you did it. Show me the bit of paper where you wrote down how many were left. Show me you getting a signature from your boss to say it's okay to go and buy them. Compliance tests are usually about bits of paper that have been signed. Now, the good thing is, if we can look at compliance tests and if we know people are following the rules, then the chances are they're not ordering any stock that they don't need to. A substantive test, on the other hand, only looks at an individual item. So with a substantive test, let's go and look at how much you paid for that one item of inventory. Did you pay too much? All I can prove with a substantive test is what happens for that one single item. Compliance tests are much more powerful. You can prove a lot without having to do much work. Substantive tests are a pain. You have to do a lot of work because each time you look at something, all you prove is that one's correct. If you were looking at debtors, for example, if you're looking at receivables, if you knew that the compliance test was good, so we've written off in debtors when we have to, you don't have to test all of them. Substantive test, have you written that debtor off? Should you have? What about this debtor? You've got to do loads of them. So auditors like compliance tests. The whole idea behind all of these, internal and external auditors, is they will come along and they will look at what you are doing. Compliance tests look at the systems that you've got. How do you make sure people don't do something they're not supposed to? Internal auditors use those all the time. External auditors use a mixture of the two.